to make it a little bit neater. And basically what happened, so like I advertised that the title of the message is Joash and Jehoiada Part 2. But the thing is, there really is no Part 1 that exists anymore, okay? I pretend that never happened, and I I deleted it, okay? So now, unfortunately, today, some of the preaching and the application that I brought last week, I'm not going to necessarily bring that out too much, other than to just kind of remind those of you that were here the points that I was trying to make. But the main purpose of this is just to introduce, or I should say clear up some of the mistakes I made last week and get us all back on the right track. And hopefully the way I do this, it'll clarify it in our minds a little bit better. Now, obviously this is more like a study, it's a lesson, it's a class. And I remember going to churches, little churches like ours, and as a child especially, or a teenager, going on there, seeing these charts and the names of kings and prophets and all that. Man, boring, just boring stuff, and I didn't really enjoy it whatsoever. That might be the case, but I hope not. I hope that many have said actually, that this has kind of helped with getting some of it in your heads, because as I mentioned, reading 1st, 2nd Kings it's really difficult, because going back and forth between the two kingdoms and all that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to break this lesson into a couple different parts, and it's all based on how much I messed up last week's, and going to try to make this right. Okay, so first thing we did is update this chart, and we're going to do a little bit of review. It might take a little while. Some have made notes. It helps you to write it out yourself or to do something yourself. I am going to try to make available a chart that has helped me. I'm not doing all this based off the chart. I'm trying to do it on my own from the Bible, because that's the only way to get it in my head. But in going back and double checking with this chart, it's helped me, and he did a really good thing organizing this, a good job organizing this. And so I make reference to it every once in a while, and I'll try to make that available to anybody that wants it. I think it would be a good thing to have, if this is anything interesting to you or not. But if you read your Bible through every year, as many do, probably something even after many, many years of reading this, you're just scratching your head thinking, man, that's just so hard to follow that. And then Chronicles lists all of them in order, and then it goes back and it starts talking about the lines, the same things that you read in 1st, 2nd Kings, and it just gets a little bit difficult. So we're going to refresh. I think a lot of people already know some of this here, but when it comes to the original kings, okay, remember the people wanted a king. God wanted them to have what we would call a theocracy, and he really didn't want them to have kings, but they wouldn't listen to the prophets and they wouldn't listen to God, so they wanted kings, and so they appointed a king that God allowed them have, to their own destruction, really, because he ended up putting them into a bad place. But that was on them because of their sin and wanting to do something differently than what God had for them. But anyway, so the first king was, everybody say, Saul. Okay, so we'll put this here. I'm only going to have this, I'm just going to flash it at you here real quick. So this is not our main focus. And this is when Israel was just a united, started to say states, but it's not states, united kingdom. You got Saul, and then David, which was a captain in Saul's army. But, well, if he started out just a shepherd boy, I understand that, but then he became a soldier in the army, a captain in his army, and then ultimately God anointed him to become the next king. And then he has a son, Solomon. So we went through all that, spent some time, and we had Saul, David, and Solomon. And God, loved David, blessed David. He's a man after his own heart. But he did have sins, obviously. The sin with Bathsheba and Uriah was the big one that kind of messed up to where God said, I'm going to bless Solomon and allow him to do some of the things that David was intending to do, like build the temple and what have you. And so Solomon, in the beginning of his reign, was right with the Lord. It was a time of peace. He was able to do those things. And in his later days, he fell aside as well. And so the punishment that God pointed out to Solomon was that, and the same thing as David, is like, it's not going to happen in your kingdom. I'm going to go ahead and bless you and allow you to finish up your kingdom strong. I mean, sort of, except for a lot of people who had fallen away. But then in your son's kingdom, it is going to be split up, and he's going to be punished. He's going to take away from him. Remember, Israel was 12 tribes. And he says he's going to take away, and 10 tribes are going to belong to Jeroboam. So he speaks to him through a prophet. I'm not going to put up the prophets, nor am I going to put up the actual dates, the years, because I don't think it's going to, I think it's just be a little bit too overwhelming. So what I'm going to try to do, though, is, see if I can knock that over is what I'm going to do. So what I'm going to try to do is keep as much as I can, just to help with some basic timeline in your mind. It won't really be a timeline, but again, as we're reading through the book of Kings, it'll say, in the such and such year of so-and-so, this other king began to reign. And what it almost always is saying is, in the year of this person's reign on this kingdom, this person began to reign. Okay, so that's how you know it's going back and forth in this in the storyline. So Rehoboam is Solomon's son, and then he's got another, kind of like David, he's got a captain that God anoints and says, hey, this is going to be the next king. And Jeroboam then is the one who, I wish that was a little bit more sturdy, but sturdier. So Jeroboam was the one who he said, I anointed you, I'm blessing you, you're going to get 10 of the tribes of the kingdom, and Rehoboam is just going to have just the southern tribe, which comes known as Judah. Now again, Judah is where we get the word Jews, and so actually people get Israel and Jews, they use them interchangeably. Technically, although sometimes in the Bible it uses the word Israel in reference to all of them, because that's just where it started and that's where God's promises were. But at this point, the Jews were actually those in the southern tribe, where Jerusalem was the capital. And in the northern tribe, Samaria ended up being the capital, until later on it was just totally assimilated and went into bondage into Assyria. So what happened was Jeroboam said, he wasn't really right with the Lord, but originally it looked like he was as you're reading through Kings. But then he is afraid that the people in these 10 tribes, they'll go to Jerusalem, which is where they were supposed to go to worship in the temple. But he was afraid that they would go to Jerusalem and they would be back into the kingdom and they would see Rehoboam's leadership there and all that. And so then he was afraid that they would go just kind of forsake him and go back to making Rehoboam the king, even though God had already promised him. But anyway, he didn't have that faith. So he decided to set up these temples there on the northern tribe. This is kind of how Samaria got established as the capital there. And he said that, there would be these golden calves. Does that sound familiar? The children of Israel and the golden calves. There'd be these golden calves, and these would be your gods. And this is your God. And he was talking about the right God, but he was putting them into this image of these calves and stuff. It's really weird, just mixing idolatry. And it ends up being bad. In fact, as I've said already many times in this series, everybody in the northern kingdom is going to be a bad king. Every king from the northern kingdom from here on out is going to fall into the sins of Jeroboam, with one exception. Anybody remember his name? Jehu. Okay? And we'll go down this line and I'll show you. But Jehu, the end of his reign was bad. But the very beginning was good, and it was like the little shine, the little glimmer of hope that Israel had, but it ends up going away at the end. But the southern tribe, it's hit and miss. Some of them are right with God and some of them aren't. But the promises are to Judah that God is going to continue to bless this line of David. And we understand as Christians, having the Word of God with us, that the reason why is because out of this lineage is going to come Jesus Christ. And so he's sparing the southern tribe, he's sparing the tribe of Judah, and he's keeping it whole. Even though they keep going into sin, he's kind of like blessing the remnant, and he's keeping them preserved. Whereas there are some good people on the northern side, but the kings keep on messing up really badly. Okay, so during Jeroboam's reign on the north side, we see pretty quickly Rehoboam makes a lot of enemies and doesn't end up, things don't end up going so well. And then we read about his son, Abijah. Now, this is still in the reign of Jeroboam, so I'm going to go ahead and put this in this blue section. And the Bible says about Abijah that he didn't follow God, he didn't do right, but for the sake of David, for the sake of this lineage thing and being able to bless, he basically allows him to set up the kingdom for the next king, which ends up being a good king. And he has one of the longest reigns, maybe the longest reign, I'm not sure. And that is Asa. Okay, so as you're following along in the Kings, it's taking you down all these genealogies. And then again, it'll be confusing because it'll talk about Asa and then it'll make it sound like he lives his life so many years and he reigns this long and then he dies. But then it'll still keep talking about him for a while. And the reason why is because it now switches back over to the north side. And so it's talking about during this year of his reign, because we already talked about him, but back whenever he had reigned for this many years, and then it talks about the next king over here. And some of this might be slightly off, but we're pretty close, right? I'm going off the top of my head here, but it's pretty close. All right, so with Jeroboam, because Asa's kingdom is going to be quite a while now, so now it's going to go back to this northern kingdom, and it's going to catch us up a little bit. And what happens is Jeroboam's son, Nadab, follows in his ways, and he is a wicked king as far as going after the same sins, leading the people into the same sins. But he is the son of Jeroboam. Okay, so now here we have, obviously all of these tribes are going to be sons that rule because, again, the whole bloodline thing and going to the time of Christ. Over here, sometimes you're going to have sons that reign, and sometimes you're going to have captains that come and overthrow those kings, and then they reign by force. Okay, this was the case with the next king, which is Baasha. Baasha overthrows Nadab. I'm going to have to keep these close here because Asa's reign was pretty long. And the Bible says that in all the days of Baasha, he was at war with Asa. Okay, so there was no harmony at all. There's nothing but division here. But Baasha was a captain who came and overthrew Nadab and went, which was a fulfillment of prophecy, and slew all the seed of Jeroboam. And talk about the dung that we talked about this morning, like, hey, some people's death and it would be, just kind of like dung. That's the kind of promises that are made every time God's like, I'm going to wipe out your seed and your death's not going to be a valiant death at all. That's kind of what goes on. Okay, so then Baasha, I'm kind of lost here. I can't remember if this was his son. Yes, Elah was Baasha's son. He's the next on the list. And so again, it's not a continued line. This was just a captain who took over, but now he passed it on to his son. And now during his reign, a captain in his army is going to take over. And he's like reigning for like just hardly any time at all. Do you remember how long it was? Let me see. I think it says, I don't know. We're just talking about like days. It's like nothing, a few days or something like that. And the captain is going to immediately overthrow him. And then Baasha, if you remember, who killed all his seed, and he did wickedly as well. But God promised that Baasha, the same thing was going to happen to him. All his seed was going to be wiped out. Well, this captain that overthrows Elah is also going to kill all the seed of Baasha, and his name was Zimri. Zimri. Let me check and make sure I didn't make a mistake on this. Yeah. Or you know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, Zimri is the one that only reigned a couple days. All right. I'm close, okay? I'm a whole lot closer than I was last week on some of this. Okay, so Zimri is the one that lasted only a couple days because he rose up to overthrow Elah and killed all the seed of Baasha, and right away they said, we got to get this guy off the throne. And so the next one on the list is Omri, who also was a captain from his army. Okay, so there's no bloodline here. But so far in the book of First Kings so far, we're at the end of 1 Kings, and it's spent a lot of time now on Jeroboam's reign because Asa's reign's going pretty smooth. And we already talked about Asa. There wasn't a whole lot to say from that point on. I think Chronicles delves into it a little bit more. You know what? I have to look at this and see. Yeah, Omri is still in this. Actually, Omri is up here a little bit more, so I'm kind of overlap. I'm going too far, but this is all still during the reign of Asa. All right. Everybody's kind of still with me? Somewhat? Okay, now, at the very end of Asa's reign, remember, still a godly man over here, then now Ahab is going to be on the scene. And Ahab, remember that for the most part, these guys, they're still in great sin because they're leading them into idolatry in the sense of the golden calves and all that. They're not worshiping in Jerusalem where they're supposed to be. And so in many ways, there's still a lot of sin going on, but they're not worshiping Baal. They're not worshiping other gods. They're just worshiping God incorrectly. And it's enough to say that they're wicked kings. It's enough to make God mad. But it's not to the extent that we see this kingdom take a turn in Ahab's days. And we all know why that is, right? Jezebel. He marries Jezebel. He was already obviously not wicked. I mean, not good. He had a wicked heart. But when he marries Jezebel, like takes it to the next level, and the Bible even mentions that. And so it wasn't enough just that he sinned, but he went and he took a daughter she was just big into Baal worship, and she has some kind of power, apparently. I don't know who her dad was, but she is able to bring all these prophets of Baal, and they do what she wants them to do, and she totally takes Israel into this dark, just wicked place. Now, not in Asa's day, and in fact, Asa has a son. Now the story goes back to the southern kingdom. Asa has a son. Anybody remember his name? It's Jehoshaphat. Jumping Jehoshaphat. I tried to look up the origin of that phrase, jumping Jehoshaphat, and I don't think it has anything to do with Jehoshaphat in the Bible. I think it just comes from a story or something somebody made up. Okay. So, the end of Asa's reign, Ahab begins to reign in the northern kingdom. Now, Jehoshaphat begins a little bit after Ahab, but let's see here. Yeah, a little bit after Ahab reigns. And then at some point, he ends up making an alliance with Ahab. Okay, now a prophet comes to him. I think Jehu the prophet, not the Jehu that's going to be a king, but Jehu the prophet says, "What are you doing so wickedly? Why are you loving what God hates? And why are you teaming up with something that's so wicked. God doesn't want anything to do with the sin that's going on over here. Now, by the way, at the end of Ahab's life, he actually sort of repents. Like, he still goes into history as a wicked guy, but he sort of repents, and so God is a little bit merciful on him and doesn't destroy him to the extent that he deserved, for sure. But as you read that, and then as you compare it with 2 Chronicles, you find out that there's more going on than just a little bit of an alliance. It's not just like, hey, you know what, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. There was a major uniting that went on here. And the way we know that is that Ahab gave one of his daughters to marry one of Jehoshaphat's sons. Okay, this really kind of connected them, and then their sons are going to make an alliance with their sons. And this is where everything gets mixed up from this point on. And this is where I got so confused. And I thought I had it in my head, but then last week when I started trying to go through it, I was like, I'm lost. I can't remember. And so I was really mixing some things up. Okay, so let me try to clarify that. Now, here's how we're going to clarify that. We are going to try to find something that I lost. Okay, here we go. Here's how we are going to do this. This is where I got really mixed up, okay? For now, we are going to put, I got to do this first, okay? So Jehoshaphat's son that marries Ahab's daughter is Jehoram. So let me find this. Jehoram. If I had to redo this, I'd make a stronger back. That's going to bug you all. I didn't even cut these the right length. I was like, I'm not going to worry about it that much. And then I could just visualize people out there going, oh. Okay. So for now, since that's Jehoram, and Joram is another name that he's called, but the problem is there's going to be another Jehoram on this side, and he's also called Joram, and so it really doesn't matter. I'm just going to call both of them Jehoram, okay? But it doesn't matter because it says it both ways in the text, okay? Now I'm going to put her right here because she marries Jehoram. Now, at one point in the series, I said that Athaliah was Jezebel's daughter, and basically like a miniature Jezebel, and she did all that. The reality is we don't really know that because Ahab had a lot of other wives. Now, it makes sense because of how wicked Jezebel was, and then this lady kind of continues that on and brings that over into the southern tribe, this Baal worship. So we could kind of make that comparison with Jezebel, but we really don't know. All we know is that she's definitely Ahab's daughter, but we don't really know that Jezebel was the mom. Does that make sense? But she's at least the stepmom, I guess you could say. But regardless, she's still wicked just like Jezebel is. And now you've brought this sin and this Baal worship and all that over into the southern kingdom. Now, Ahab has got a whole bunch of children, but the ones that we know that it talks about that it relates to this to being the king is Ahaziah. I kind of lost my. Okay, so Ahaziah was towards the end of Jehoram's. No. Toward the end of Jehoshaphat's reign. All right, let's see here. Let's put him here. That's close enough. It won't make that big of a difference. Okay, now this Ahaziah is Ahab's son. Now, when Ahaziah dies, he didn't have any children. Now, again, northern kingdom. So this line is so incomplete, which really makes it marvelous if you count all that and you figure out how many times it's a captain that's the next offspring, or all these various things. In this case, it's still kind of bloodline, I guess, but it wasn't his son. It's his brother, which I guess still, like I said, is still in the blood. But his brother reigns because of the fact that he didn't have any children. And this is where it gets so confusing, because of the fact that we got two Jehorims reigning at the same time. And sometimes it calls them Jehoram, sometimes it calls them Joram. All right, but the thing to take note is that what did I do? I spelled it. No, that's right. Ahaliah. Is it spelled right? Okay. Ahaliah is married to Jehoram, and they're wicked. And then these are Ahab's sons who are still wicked, following in the sins of Ahab. And so you got both tribes here that are wicked, and it's just like, all right, how are we going to save this? There's no godly seed, and it's about even to get worse, and it's going to even look more hopeless for Judah. And I feel like during this time, Satan is excited, because he's like, oh, we almost got him. We're going to wipe out. I don't completely understand how Satan, to what degree he knows about the genealogy and who Christ is going to be and all that. But we know this, he certainly knows the promises were to him, and he's certainly working hard to destroy that line. But God so far has kept that line pure, even though this has been a mess. And it's just been like different captains and different people that don't even have sons. And over here, he's keeping the line. But something happens. Jehoram has on the northern side has a son named Jehu. And this is who I mentioned earlier that was like a glimmer of hope for the northern tribe. So far, everyone's been wicked, to the point where you have Ahab, and it says no one was as wicked. Now later on, there's going to be some kings worse than him. But no one was ever as wicked as Ahab was wicked up until this point, because of Jezebel and all her sins. And so, obviously, it fell in line with the sons. Now, it seems like maybe because of the fact that Jehoshaphat was still a good king who served the Lord, loved the Lord. You remember that instance where they're going to battle, and Jehoshaphat's like, hey, is there a man of God that we can inquire and see, get some good counsel? And he's like, well, yeah, there's some men of God who tell me what I want to hear. You know what I mean? And so Jehoshaphat is still a good king, and he's just not buying it. He's like, no, there needs to be somebody. And he meets Micaiah and all that. Okay? So it seems like even though he allowed, a good king, allowed a bad relationship in this alliance to put sin into his side of the family, that possibly there was also a slight influence of from his good into the northern kingdom, because all of a sudden you see this light, this glimmer of hope, and Jehu says, you know what? And I'm not mentioning who all the prophets were that were counseling them and all that, but because we already have enough names to deal with. Okay, but Jehu comes on the scene and says, and God ordained him to do this, the Bible says, that I am going to clean things up. So he goes and kills everybody that's left in Ahab's line. He just wipes them all out. And then he cleans out, which actually is somewhat still tied to Ahab, he cleans out all of his line, Jehoram's line. This is, at this point, Jehoshaphat's dead. He cleans out all his line as well. And I'm talking about he just slays them, he just kills them, and just let God sort it all out later on. He's just killing them. And God actually wanted this to happen because of the wickedness that had entered into Judah. So after he kills Jehoram, nope, I messed up. Okay, I messed up. Looking at my wife because she's been trying to keep me in line on this. Not that she knows it, but when I'm making mistakes, she's just like, oh, I got to study and look ahead. So she's learning. That's what I'm saying, is that's what's helping her to learn better. Am I right? Okay, but here's what I forgot to say. Jehoram and Athaliah had a son who ends up being king named Ahaziah. Once again, the reason this is so confusing is you've got Joram and Ahaziah and Joram, all right? But they're totally different people. They're just intermingled some way by marriage. So Athaliah, this is her son. Now when Jehu comes on the scene, he kills Ahaziah, he kills Joram on the northern kingdom, he kills everybody involved, and Ahaziah has children as well who would be next on the throne. But guess what? Apparently, Athaliah wants to be the authority. That's the only reason I can figure out why she does this. But she decides to kill all the seed royal that's left, which would be her grandchildren. And maybe children, I don't know who's left, but I know that Jehu kills a whole bunch of children. You know, he kills a whole bunch of people. So I don't know who all was left, but anybody that was left, Athaliah kills them. And so she actually becomes the active king, if you will, or the queen, for a period of time. And so what happens next, this is getting us up to where we left off last week and where I really messed stuff up. But what happens is she kills, and this is another thing that confuses me, because when I put her down there, I start to forget that she's actually married to him. Okay, so this is an old woman now who is now in the place where her grandchildren should be. But she has now tried to kill all of her grandchildren. But then there is one child who is discovered, or who is spared, okay, because somebody in the family, which would be Ahaziah's, this would be Ahaziah's sister, okay? So this is Athaliah's either daughter or at least stepdaughter. Okay, there's a relationship here, and I'm going to go ahead and put her name up here. She's not a king, but I put it in red so you'll know that it's a woman. And she comes into play. Let me just put her right there. Because she spares Joash. And Joash, at 7 years old, is going to be the next king over here. Which means Jehu is king for 7 years, and during which some of this time, Athaliah is acting as the king, because there is no other king to take her place. Now, Joash is born, but I'm talking about he's an infant, and he is being held in the temple and raised in the temple by the priest, who is Jehoshaba's husband. All right, so this is, I'm really surprised you guys are all like watching and seem to be following along to some degree, because I felt like everybody would be dead by now. Maybe you are inside. Okay, so I'm going to put him right here, because Jehoiada is married to Jehoshaphat, which means he is also the son-in-law to some degree, or step-son-in-law or whatever. We don't know the exact relationship to Athaliah. But so in a manner of speaking, even though she is kind of the acting ruler over this kingdom right now because there's nobody on the throne, he steps up, and he's the priest in the temple, and he steps up and begins to lead the people and talk to them about what to do next. And basically what they do is whenever he's 7 years old, they decide, they guard the temple, and he's like, you stay at this exit, you stay at this exit, and just guard this boy, Joash. Just guard him and don't let him out of your sight. Don't let anybody, because he does not want him to be destroyed. He's being preserved, right, to be the king on the godly tribe. Actually, Jesus' genealogy, he's being preserved in that. So they're watching that. And Joash, at 7 years old, is now crowned the king of the northern kingdom. And whenever they're all saying, hail the king, whatever it is they say, Athaliah overhears this. And she goes to the door, she peeks in and looks in there, and they're all like, got this 7-year-old boy that they're all putting up and set him up to be the next king. And she's like, treason, treason. Well, they, long story short, end up hunting her down and killing her, okay, because to get her out of the way. And now Joash is the reigning king at 7 years old. Okay, so I've cleared up a couple things now and tried to fix some things that I messed up. But let me clear one more thing that I messed up last week. Because the whole point of my message last week is that Joash needed a Jehoiada. He needed a man of God, and he was a good man. He went down in the history of Judah as this godly man. They had a proper burial for him, and they really lifted up his name because he was a godly king. I mean, a godly man. He was a man of God. But he also was basically like co-king as Joash was being raised, because who's going to make decisions to rule the nation at 7 years old? And so right away at his ordination, I guess or what do you call that? Coronation, he actually makes this pact and says, we are going to serve God. Because of him, Joash accepts that, receives that, and says, yes, on my kingdom, we're going to worship God. We're going to do right. Okay, where I messed up last week is I didn't think past the fact that, yes, Joash needs Jehoiada. And here's a 7-year-old kid that doesn't know what to do, and he needs a man of God to. And then I ended up talking about the end of whenever Jehoiada dies, and he ends up dying at like 130 or something like that. He lives a nice long life, but then he dies, and then all of a sudden the principal men come in, and they sweet talk Joash, and they talk him into doing some things, which he regrets later on, and then he ends up getting overthrown. So the point that I made was, you see what happened when Jehoiada, the man of God, was out of the picture, then this young man, Joash, is left to make these decisions, and he's not prepared because he doesn't have counsel from a godly man, which is still true, except the fact that I wasn't thinking that he's not 7 years old anymore, okay? Because we read in somewhere like in the 20th year of his reign or something like that is when he decides to restore the temple and to fix the breaches in the wall and all that kind of stuff. And by this time, he's making the decisions as a somewhat of an adult. And he's saying, hey, and he's even getting on to Jehoiada because it's not being done. And so who's kind of been like a father to him as well as a spiritual counselor. But still, at the end of the day, without the counsel of Jehoiada, he does end up making some mistakes. He still goes down as a good king, and he did some great things. But then because after Jehoiada dies, they kind of infiltrate Joash and put somebody else on the throne, and it ends up going bad again, okay? That gets us caught up, and I have nothing. We didn't look at a lot of Bible. I don't have a lot of preaching, but we got caught up. Now, unfortunately, we're going to run out of room, and I can't make this any longer. So what I'll do next time is I'll just consolidate all of them kind of like this and move them up to the top of this so that we can add some more kings. But if the one application is, and we've already heard it, these are the applications that I've made for the last few lessons, is that, boy, it really messed up when this good, godly man mixed up with this ungodly genealogy, this ungodly nation. And even though he might have had some good influence on Ahab, he might have helped spare him from just total destruction, it still affected his children. It still affected his kingdom. And so therefore, we see all this wickedness and all this confusion and all this stuff happens from this point on. And the only saving grace they had is some men of God came and corrected that whole situation. And unfortunately, it still goes south. No pun intended. But it still goes south from there. And but the lineage of Jesus Christ was spared, almost destroyed, although we know that God bigger than any enemy. So he takes care of that. And then from this point on, it goes down the line. All right, so let's go to the Lord in prayer and be dismissed. Father, thank you for your word, and thank you for helping us to hopefully kind of clear some things up today. And I pray that you'll help us to continue and benefit from this study and see what you spent quite a bit of your word talking about, Lord, with the 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and then all the prophets make mention of these kings. And I pray that you just help us to get an understanding of this so that when we read our Bible, these timelines and these people will help us to make sense out of some things and get a better, clearer picture of it. I pray you help us do that and use that for your honor and glory. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.